Hi students, this is Mr. Eckert and we're going to go through targets C10 and C11. That'll finish us out for this set of targets in our section on cells here. Target C10 says that you should be able to explain the process of diffusion as it relates to homeostasis, and I'm sure you remember that homeostasis is one of those characteristics of all living things, which we'll touch on in a moment here. So first, diffusion, the definition of it is shown by this animation here. It's when molecules move randomly from areas of high concentration to an area of low concentration until they reach a balance. So notice some key things. They're moving randomly. They always start out where they're highly concentrated and move towards a lower concentration, and they keep doing so until they're balanced. You can see that in the animation. Those little purple dots are pretty balanced as they've moved across that square there. So this happens with a number of different things. When you're sitting in your bedroom and your mom starts to make some chocolate chip cookies, you smell them because of diffusion. Those chocolate chip cookie molecules were really highly concentrated in the oven, and they're moving randomly. They sneak their way out of the oven and start moving across the house, and they're trying to balance themselves out. In a living thing, inside a living thing, this would happen, of course, with different kinds of substances. Oxygen would be an example. You take a breath of air into your lungs, and the oxygen in the air, do you know what percentage oxygen is in the air? Can't have trouble speaking there. It's about 21%. So when you breathe in a lung full of air, there's a higher percentage of oxygen in the air than is in your bloodstream. So the oxygen just diffuses into your bloodstream. It moves from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. Likewise, carbon dioxide, of course, is at a higher concentration in your blood than it is in the air. So at the same time as the oxygen in your lungs is diffusing into your bloodstream, the carbon dioxide in your bloodstream is diffusing out into that air that's in your lungs. So simple diffusion happens directly across the cell membrane. Here's the diagram again. This is the cell membrane here, and you can see that molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, as long as they're small and they don't have any electrical charge, they can just slip right through the cell membrane, either from outside to inside or inside to outside. And that's just called simple diffusion, as opposed to facilitated diffusion, where the cell would have to help those molecules. But simple diffusion, they just slip right on through. Kind of like if you had a screen in a window and you open the window up, the air is going to pass right on through without any help from you. You're not going to need to put a fan or anything in order to move that air. So remember, it says oxygen and water are essential to all living organisms. Carbon dioxide is essential to plants. Now, oxygen and water, of course, are essential to plants too. So those things just move through, in and out of cells by simple diffusion. Homeostasis, remember, is the ability of all organisms to keep their internal environment relatively stable. It doesn't change much, even though there's changes in the external environment. So if you've ever visited somebody in the hospital, you might have seen this little red thing on their finger. It has a red light on it, and that's measuring their blood saturation level, or it's sometimes called pulse ox. And if you look at the machine that's got all the numbers on it that shows their blood pressure and their heart rate and all that, there's a number that relates to their pulse ox. And if they're healthy, it should be in the high 90s or maybe even 100. When my granddaughter was born, her pulse ox was in the 80s and then dropped to the 70s. So she was born so quickly, she didn't have time. She wasn't in the birth canal long enough for the fluid that was in her lungs to get squeezed out. So she had trouble absorbing oxygen until they were able to get all that fluid out, and then her pulse ox levels rose. So that's it for that target. Target C11 says that you should be able to explain the concept or the idea of osmosis and then predict the movement of water across the cell membrane in three different kinds of solutions: hypotonic, hypertonic, and isotonic. And we'll go over those one at a time. So first, osmosis is a kind of diffusion. But remember, diffusion is when molecules move from high concentration to low randomly until there's a balance. Well, in osmosis, it's water that's doing that. So in osmosis, it's only water that is moving across the membrane. And it does move from high concentration to low concentration again until it's trying to achieve a balance of concentrations. So, as it says here, during osmosis, water moves from high concentration to low concentration. Two terms that you should be familiar with is a solvent and a solute. A solvent is something that dissolves something else. A solute is something that is dissolved in a solvent. So water is called a solvent. Anything that dissolves in the water are solutes. So when you make Kool-Aid, you're making a solution, right? The sugar and the Kool-Aid powder, those are the solutes. And the water, of course, is the solvent. So there's three terms, again, that you need to be familiar with that describe what's happening in osmosis. One is a hypotonic solution, the other is isotonic, and the other is a hypertonic. So hypo, the prefix hypo, means less. So it's referring to the solute. Remember, the solute is what's dissolved in a solvent. So if there's less solute dissolved, think about a glass of water that's pure water, and you take a spoonful of salt and dissolve it in it. What happens to the percentage of water? It goes down, right? So if you dissolve 2 teaspoons or tablespoons of salt in that same glass, you're going to drive the percentage of water down even further. So the higher the amount of solute, the less the concentration of water. And remember, this osmosis works just by concentration. It's always moving from high concentration towards low. Hyper means more, so that's referring to more solute. And it says here that these are relative terms. We're comparing what's outside the cell to what's inside the cell. So you can see here inside the cell, it's very hypotonic. I don't see anything dissolved in this. It's all water molecules. But outside the cell, you've got a lot of solute, and so you have less water molecules, so there's a lower concentration of water outside the cell than in, and that's why the water is going to move from where it's highly concentrated here towards where it's a low concentration. It always does that. Think of a hill with a bucket of water on top of the hill. If you knock the bucket over, it's always going to move downhill because of gravity and elevation. So think of it that way, with the hill representing concentrations. High concentration at the top, low concentration on the bottom. The water is going to flow downhill. It always moves from high concentration towards low concentration. Here you're going to see that happening. We're going to drop red blood cells in each of these three different kinds of solutions. So first we're going to drop it into a hypertonic solution. Remember, that has a lot of solutes dissolved in it, so the concentration of water is lower outside the cell and water moves out. In a hypotonic solution, it's the opposite. The concentration is high outside the cell, so water moves in, and you can see the cell gets bigger and bursts. And in an isotonic solution, the concentration of water inside the cell is the same as outside, so water moves in and out at the same rate. And the size of the cell stays the same. So this is going to go through this multiple times just so that you get the idea. So again, in a hypertonic solution, there's more solute outside, so that lowers the concentration of water, and the water moves out of the cell and the cell shrinks and will probably die. Hypotonic is the opposite. The concentration of water is higher outside the cell, so water moves in because it's trying to balance. The cell is going to grow in size, probably burst, and then die, of course. And in an isotonic, it stays the same. Now here's something that might help you to remember this. The word hyper, you probably think of a person who's got a lot of energy. So if they're really hyper, they've got a lot of energy, they're bouncing off the walls inside, and they just have to get out of the room to release some of that energy. So that might help you to think that a cell in a hypertonic solution, the water is going to move out. A hypotonic, I think of a hypodermic needle. When you get a shot from a doctor, that's a hypodermic needle. The medicine's going into your arm. So in a hypotonic solution, water is going to move into the cell. Hopefully that'll help you. So it says, left unchecked, the swelling caused by a hypotonic solution could cause a cell to burst. There are some cells that have adaptations to solve that problem and maintain homeostasis. So plants and fungi, or fungi cells, they have rigid cell walls that keep the cell from expanding too much. That helps with that process if they're in a hypotonic environment. There are organisms that live in pond water and in marine water, ocean water, that are called protists, and they have these contractile vacuoles. You can see in this microscopic photograph. Here's a contractile vacuole. It looks like a star or a sun. And their job is to pump water out of the cell. So in your house, you probably have a sump pump in the basement. You may have noticed a tube coming out of the floor and an electrical cord that plugs into an electrical outlet. Well, the tube goes outside of your house through the wall. That's your sump pump. And if it rains a lot, the level of water underneath your house starts to rise. And once it gets above your sump pump, which is buried in a hole underneath your basement floor, then it comes on and it pumps that water out through the pipe, through your wall, out to the street where it goes down a storm sewer. So these contractile vacuoles and protists work about the same way. When there's too much water coming in because it's in, let's say, a hypotonic solution, then these contractile vacuoles can pump the water out. So again, that's another example of how a living thing is trying to maintain a stable internal environment even when there's changes outside. I think that does it for this target. It says maintaining stable internal environments relates to that range of tolerance that we discussed earlier in targets 8 and 9. I think it was target 9. And of course, if the organisms can't maintain that range of tolerance, then they're going to die, like you see these salmon dying here. So that does it for that target. If you have any questions, please make sure you ask in class or outside of class.